suitable for people. This is suitable for people in Europe, in Africa, in North and Latin America, but we also realize that this timing is not necessarily so good for those who are further east to us. So this will be recorded, so I want you to be aware of that. It would be very nice if we can see all your pictures, at least at the beginning, but we'll ask you to keep your microphones on mute, please. My name is Audrey Osler, and I'm a professor at USN, University of Southeastern Norway, and at the University of Leeds in the UK. I'm the coordinator with Professor Hugh Starkey of this network on human rights education. As I've said, it's an international research network, so it's open to all researchers. But these webinars that we have this evening are, and running throughout the year, we hope, will be open to people who are researchers, but also open to people who come from policy fields, related fields, and we know that there are people interested in human rights education, not just in education settings, but amongst civil servants, in the health services, and in the police force, many other groups. And so this series of webinars is open to all those people. So if anybody asks you about them, please do say we welcome anyone. You don't have to be a researcher to be sitting here for this seminar. I want to say a little bit about the network that we belong to. The network was set up in 2019, and it was set up with a group of people who belong to one of the national or regional education research networks. So that could be the American Education Research Network, it could be the Nordic Education Research Network, Australian, anywhere around the world, European. So those are the core people who joined originally. But if you want to be part of this network and you are a researcher, you are more than welcome. A network is not a closed club. It is open to all who are interested and engaged in researching human rights education. We have various links. We have two main pillars. One is the journal Human Rights Education Review, and the other is the ICDC conference from London. The ICDC conference will not happen this summer as it does normally, but the journal Human Rights Education Review is open access. It's producing work on human rights education. Some of you, I know, are planning to submit to it. I can see people here who've already submitted and contributed, and we're very, very appreciative of your contributions. So then the journal is open to you. You can go to it and draw on it as and when you need. Tonight's webinar is sponsored by a group of people, by my own university, USN, University of Southeastern Norway, by UCL London, and by WERA itself, and by the Human Rights Educators USA. Although I think we have a little bit of competition today for the attention of our US colleagues. Before handing over to Professor Hugh Starkey, I want to talk to you a little bit about some practical arrangements this evening. As I've said, we are being recorded. If you have a question for the presenters, we invite you to put your question in the chat column as and when you think of it. We won't be interrupting them, but if you put those questions there, Hugh Starkey will be able to see those. And if you put your name, at least your first name after your question, then he can come back to you and invite you to put your question in person. If you keep your question anonymous, then he'll have to ask it on your behalf. We're also encouraging you to tweet about this session. So if you're a Twitter user, we're using the hashtag HRE 2021 webinar. HRE 2021 webinar. I think those are all the practical things. I'd now like to hand over to Hugh Starkey, who'll be introducing tonight's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, and welcome everyone. We've got a group of people from across the world. It's a very auspicious day, I think the 20th of January 2021, since we have got about to be inaugurated a new president of the United States who seems to actually believe in human rights. And that's a huge relief and a huge change after the past 4 years. We are starting our webinar series with a presentation that is based on a publication that has already been published in Human Rights Education Review, open access review for human rights educators. We have two presenters, Beate Goldschmidt-Gjerløw and Irene Trysnes. They're both from the University of Agder and Kristiansand in southern Norway. And they are going to be talking about tackling sexual harassment at school using a human rights framework. Some of you may have had the opportunity to actually read the paper, but I think it'll their presentation will actually bring it to life as it's illustrated, and it will be even more lively. It starts from the perspective of an incident of severe sexual harassment in a school where a teacher was actually severely sexually harassed. And a 17-year-old student also was the victim of sexual harassment from classmates. And Beate and Irene have tried to kind of theorize this and to think about what are the possibilities of using a human rights perspective in thinking about the pedagogical possibilities of learning from such situations, from using such situations. I think it would be great now just to go to their presentation. We expect it to take about half an hour, after which we will be very happy to have your comments and questions to Beate and Irene. But over to Beate and Irene.
Thank you very much, Audrey and Hugh. We are delighted to be invited to this webinar series, and we would like to thank both Audrey and Hugh for inviting us to discuss our work on Me Too in school. We will be looking at teachers and young learners' lived experience of verbal sexual harassment as a pedagogical opportunity. And we are very excited to see participants from all over the world, and we would very much appreciate your questions after our presentation. And before we get into our article, we would like to briefly present ourselves.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to present our paper. My name is Irene Trysnes, and I'm an associate professor in social science didactics. I also coordinate the teacher education at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Agder. I have background as a secondary school teacher, and I have my PhD within the field of sociology of religion. My research interests are in social studies didactics, youth research, gender and equality studies, and sociology of religion. My research has been on youth in Christian festivals and Christian youth groups. I have been looking on flirting in Christian festivals for youth and how young people combine flirtation and religious experiences in these festivals. I have also studied gendered performances, research and participant roles during festival fieldwork. Some of my recent research is a study of young people's attitudes towards the use of religious symbols, and also a study of religious self-presentation on social media among young Muslims and Christians with minority background. Currently, I'm working on a study of students' experiences with sexual harassment in professional practical training, and another study of teachers' experiences with extreme attitudes and radicalization in school. And I'm also very lucky to be a Beate supervisor and have had the opportunity to contribute a bit on this article.
Yes, I am a political scientist and teacher turned researcher. I have a master's degree in peace studies and conflict transformation, and my early work explored how children's rights, whether or not they were recognized during the democratization processes in Argentina in the post-conflict period. What you could say as a red thread in my work is the focus on children's rights in different contexts. And when I was working as a teacher in upper secondary school, I had the kind of like an epiphany that we had to teach about sexual violence after watching a Norwegian TV series called Skam, where we meet the protagonist Nora, who thinks she was drugged and raped. And this was in 2016 when I was working as a teacher, and I said to my colleagues, we have to teach about sexual violence, and they did not necessarily agree with me. And that ignited my interest in exploring whether or not teachers actually address sexual violence. And it motivated me to go on with a PhD dissertation about teaching about sexual violence in upper secondary schools in Norway. And I'm especially focusing on whether or not teaching is recognizing children's rights. And what you see here is a list of previous publications. The first publication linked to my dissertation was Children's Rights and Teachers' Responsibilities, which is also published in the Human Rights Education Review. And it looks into how especially child abuse is silenced in teaching, and how this is a breach of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the article we will be discussing here today is the Me Too in School that I wrote with Irene. And this year, in a week or two, the third one is being published about exploring variation in sexuality education. Yes. And I'm also currently editing an anthology called Controversial, Emotional and Sensitive Issues in School, to be published this year. And I'm very excited about this anthology because we're looking into a wide range of topics and how teachers and students experience teaching about racism, extremism, hate speech, Me Too, gender, sexuality, pornography also. And I think it will be a good contribution in the field of the controversial issues in education. And now we will look further into how the Norwegian context for sexual harassment before we move on to see the link between human rights and sexual harassment.
Yes, research shows that in Norway, 29% of girls and 7% of boys aged 18 to 19 years have experienced sexual harassment in severe forms. And research also shows that sexual harassment often isn't taken seriously, and especially when it comes to children and youth.
Yes, and we will now be looking at the international framework for human rights in regards to sexual harassment. And given that we focus on both adult teachers and young learners, we have included two conventions. And the first convention is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is especially important in regard to the teacher's experience of being sexually harassed. In our article, we discuss Article 11 in this convention, the right to freedom from discrimination in employment, which we consider to include the freedom from being sexually harassed at work as a teacher. And regarding the young learners and the framework protecting their rights, we discussed several articles in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And perhaps Article 29 is the most important one. And it confirms that state parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to the preparation of the child for responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of sexes, and friendship among all peoples, ethnic, national, and religious groups, and persons of indigenous origin. Another article, of course, of great relevance is the right to be heard. We see that our empirical material shows that at times children's voices are not heard when they are sexually harassed, which we will explore further in this presentation. And we link it to human rights education about, through, and for human rights. Education about rights in regard to sexual harassment would entail teaching about the CEDAW and teaching about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the relevant articles in these conventions. But of course, this would not be sufficient because education through rights in practice will require intervention when learners face sexually harassing situations. And it's especially the intervention part that is worrisome, because there appears to be little intervention when children's rights are being violated in this regard. And only through intervention in practice can the education actually work for their rights, for children's rights in education. I would like to tell a bit about the overall study and the overall data collection. In 2018, I conducted structured interviews with 64 social studies teachers, and the survey consisted of 53 questions regarding their background and their experience, and whether or not they address different kinds of issues related to sexual violence, whether they cooperated at school regarding developing teaching lessons, whether the school management enabled the teacher's competence regarding teaching about sexual violence, and also emotional aspects, whether or not they felt it was challenging to address these issues. And among these 64 social science teachers was Ingun, young female teacher Ingun in her 30s. And although the structured survey did not include personal questions with teachers' own experience with sexual harassment. She told me about her experience of being sexually harassed when I asked whether or not she felt that it was challenging to address sexual violence in the classroom. And I found her experience so interesting, because I saw that it was not the curriculum motivating her to do this kind of teaching. It was not the Me Too movement, because her experience was prior to the Me Too movement, or any other kinds of factors. It was her personal experience that motivated her to address sexual harassment. And I decided to conduct an additional in-depth interview with Ingunn. And this time, the interview was not structured. I only focused on her experience of being sexually harassed and how she dealt with it, without any prior theoretical lenses. And so it was very much just focusing on her side of the story, you could say. And in this, you could say one limitation of this study is that we only have Ingunn's perspective. We could also include, we would also like to include the perspective of Mary, the young 17-year-old girl who experienced being sexually harassed, but I was not granted access to information about Mary. But in order to strengthen the children's voices, we decided to do a mixed method study, combining a survey that Irene and her colleague Katja Schølberg conducted among secondary students, and how often they report being sexually harassed and whether or not anyone actually intervenes. So the limitation of method of not actually talking to Mary was somewhat countered by combining this survey. And I will now proceed to go into Ingunn's case. Ingunn, she was a teacher, a young teacher for a class specializing in vocational studies. And in that class, there were only boys, approximately 17-year-old, and one girl, Mary. And in that class, they had a kind of a pre-established culture of harassing each other. And Ingunn sought to counter that by joking or using humor instead of being strict. But it was not a very efficient strategy. And the harassment also later targeted Mary and the teacher herself, Ingunn. And in class one day, one of her students asked her whether or not she was any good at giving blowjobs. And that was the final straw for Ingunn. And she went directly to the principal's office and told Eva, the principal, about her experience and that she felt humiliated. And fortunately, the principal recognized her experience, and she knew that the Working Environment Act protects Ingunn's rights from being sexually harassed at work. And she said, should I go and talk to them? Should I do something? But Ingunn, she decided to deal with this situation on her own. But we believe that this support from the principal was very important for her will to push back in a way. And we discussed it as an institutional strength, that the principal was supportive of Ingunn and that she recognized her rights. And what Ingunn did was that she had an honest conversation about her feelings, and she gathered the students in a circle and she removed the desks. And she told me that she removed the desk so that no one could hide behind anything. And she was very sincere about how she felt humiliated and disrespected, and that that kind of behavior and comments actually is not legal. And it was not a monologue, it was a dialogue, because she invited each student to comment on the situation and comment on her emotions. And what Ingen said was that she felt that it was like they were illuminated, that suddenly they had understood something they had not understood before. And she could have addressed the international legal framework, the CEDAW. She could have referred to the national legal framework in order to further strengthen the students' legal literacy. But in that situation, emphasizing that it was not legal also made a difference. And she said that she thinks that using her personal experience was what made a difference. And if they did not have that prior history, maybe they wouldn't have become illuminated in that way, which is interesting, and which is also something we discuss in light of Laura Landi and Gabriela Sain's considerations on how transformative education should be linked to lived experiences of injustice. And in this context, it was the lived experience of the teacher that was emphasized. And but there is also another dimension here that is not so, how could you say, didn't end that well, and that was for the 17-year-old girl Mary, which who Irene will talk more about in the following slide.
Yes, I'm going to say something about Mary's case, and as Beate already mentioned, this case is seen through Ingun's eyes, so you can bear that in mind. What happened to Mary was that she received sexualized messages from the boys in her class, saying that they wanted to have group sex with her. And in Mary's case, none of the teachers intervened when Mary was sexually harassed by her classmates. And this failure is a clear breach of Mary's rights to protection from sexual discrimination. However, our impression is that Ingun somehow sought to protect Mary by using herself as an example, hoping that this could raise the boys' awareness of appropriate and inappropriate sexual behavior. Ingun does not know if the boys stopped harassing Mary, but it could be that a classroom dialogue made them think twice about sending sexualized messages. What we know is that Mary dropped out of school. We do not know if the sexual harassment she experienced influenced her decision to quit school, but we believe that it could have played a role. And we also point out in our article that more research is needed on the potential links between experiences of sexual harassment in upper secondary school and dropout. Could you switch slide? Thank you. I have conducted with my colleague Katja Kjølberg a survey of secondary students in Norway with 382 respondents. And this survey shows that sexually harassing words such as gay, lesbian, and whore are the most common abusive words young learners hear. 47% of the respondents report that they hear these words being used every day or every week. According to this survey, 37% of the learners are exposed to racist or other kinds of harassing comments by other students on a daily or weekly basis. The results show that students most often hear abusive words from other students. However, 3% report that they hear abusive words from teachers on a weekly basis. This constitutes a clear breach of legal educational framework, such as the Norwegian Education Act, paragraph 9. And if you switch slides, thank you. Further, we have asked students how often they experienced that teachers or others intervene in sexually harassing situations in the school setting. 68% reporting having experienced harassing comments from teachers or students. Out of these 260 students, 38% of the respondents answer that people never or rarely intervene. This can be connected to the bystander effect developed by Daly and Latan and a fear of being involved in conflicts, and may further be related to weak school bond. A Canadian study by Sprott, Jenkins and Dubb find that a strong school bond plays an important role in preventing risk behavior such as violent and non-violent offending. Ingunn based the dialogue on her lived experience of sexual harassment. The honest conversation became transformative for that class. However, justice was not done for Mary. Laura Lundy and Gabriella Sainz argue that human rights education should include lived experience of injustice in order for the education to be transformative. This is regarded as important to enhance children's legal literacy in a way that is meaningful for their lives. Ingunn's actions can be interpreted in an intersectional perspective. Mary's gender, age, and status as a pupil matters when it comes to how seriously sexual harassment is taken. This case illustrates a clear breach of Mary's rights to protection from sexual harassment, and we argue that children's rights are not adequately taken seriously in school. Ingunn's case can also be related to Elizabeth Mayer's study from 2008. Meyer investigated barriers for intervention to prevent harassment in school. These barriers include lack of institutional support from administrators, lack of formal education on the issue, inconsistent response from colleagues, fear of parents' reactions, and negative community response. Given the multi-level complexity, this study recommended a whole school process that engages students, families, teachers, administrators, and the community to transform the formal and informal structures of schools.
Yes, and when it comes for implication for national policy, we find it highly problematic that children's rights are not adequately taken seriously in school. In my previous article, I find that teaching about sexual violence in upper secondary school to little degree is related to children's lives. And this is not in tune with Norwegian policy documents, because the policy documents emphasize the school's potential and important role as an arena for prevention and also intervention when it comes to the harassment and abuse that children experiences. And Kjersti Draugdalen, I think you are among the participants. She, in her article, discusses how Norwegian primary schools vary greatly in their response to harmful sexual behavior. And she calls for a more systematic approach based on national guidelines. And we coincide with her perspective. And the Ombudsman for Children in Norway, they urge the Norwegian Directorate for Education and Training to develop a tool for schools' preventive and systematic work in this regard.
Yes, and we also suggest that more research is needed in this field. We need more research on both prevalence causes and preventive measures. We do not know the long-term effects of teaching about sexual harassment. We need research focusing on links between high school dropout and sexual harassment, as I already mentioned. Teaching about bodily integrity and the importance of telling someone about unwanted sexual attention is associated with an increased ability for children to protect themselves. Teaching about sexual harassment is in line with UNESCO's technical guidelines for comprehensive sexuality education, which is, I quote, a curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. An essential element of comprehensive sexuality education is to enable young learners' understandings of their fundamental human rights, which can provide a basis for making them capable of ensuring both their own rights and the rights of others throughout their lives. And this year, we are planning a new survey among secondary school and upper secondary school students, focusing on both prevalence of sexual harassment and how much they have learned about sexual harassment and legal framework.
Yes, and for more details, please check out our article. And please, if you would like to read our future research, you may follow us on Twitter. And thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Beate and Irene. That was a really fascinating presentation. And what you're doing is treating a very sensitive topic, I think, but one that is particularly relevant at the moment. It's particularly relevant in the UK because in England, all schools are just about having to implement a new policy on relationships and sex education. So there's a lot of discussion about this, including in a human rights context. Could I ask the first question? We've got some good questions in the chat, so they will come on to that. But the first question really, at the center of your presentation was this confrontation between the teacher Ingun and the, I think, 7 rather nasty boys and the one girl. And I wondered to what extent Ingun actually was herself using the language of human rights. She was told by the principal that she was protected by national legislation, the Working Environment Act. And you also said later on that they're presented, that they are protected by the Education Act as well. But to what extent did Ingun actually explicitly use human rights language? And perhaps if she didn't, what are the implications for your developing thinking about how human rights education might more use human rights language?
Thank you very much, Hugh. I think you are pinpointing to a very interesting aspect of my research in general, because Ingun, she did not address the international legal framework. She slightly mentioned that it was not legal in Norway. And I think that this is related to the fact that teachers in general could use more competence, need more competence regarding the international legal framework. And that's also something I found when last year I did action research at one upper secondary school, where I cooperated with 2 teachers in order to develop teaching lessons on sexual harassment. And we included how the Convention on the Rights of the Child protects children from sexual harassment, but she was reluctant to elaborate on it. And she said that, well, she doesn't feel too familiar with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and prefer rather referring to the national legal framework. which is not necessarily representative for the whole teacher population in Norway. But I think if I compare with previous research, I see that there is not enough competence, legal competence among teachers to actually do the HRE explicitly. So what we see in Ingen's case here is an implicit human rights education, I would say.
Yes, could I just add, it's a very interesting question, that in the survey that we are working on now, we also have included questions about whether the students have learned about human rights, but also whether they have learned about the legal framework. And that will be very interesting to see how that will, what we will find out.
Yes, and can I just add one more thing? Because if I see this question in light of the previous article, the Children's Rights and Teachers' Responsibility, I found that the legal framework protecting against sexual violence is to a little degree brought up in teaching about sexual violence. And I think that and if I also look at teachers' background, many of them say that they are not especially trained in sexual violence, and many of them are not particularly trained in legal studies or law either. And I think that's a clear challenge for actually realizing human rights education in Norway, at least.
Right. Thank you. I've got questions from Jing Williams, from Minnie, and from Janice at the moment. So in that order, Jing Williams, would you like to ask your question, which is a rather technical question about the design of the research? You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Sure. Thank you, Hugh, for letting me ask this question. When the first author was just at the beginning of her study, she said she interviewed 64 social studies teachers. I just wonder, how did you identify those 64 teachers?
Yes, that was a lot of work. It took almost the entire 2018 to get a hold of them. But luckily, I have worked as a teacher for many years, and I know many gate openers. So I contacted former colleagues, asking them if they could help me put me in contact with eligible candidates. I sent emails to school managements all over the country. I published a request on the national Facebook page, a national Facebook page for social science teachers, and I also did like snowball recruiting through the informants that I already recruited. And it was very time consuming, and I had originally planned to interview up to 200, which I see now was very ambitious because it was so difficult to get a hold of them. And I think this is due to the topic's nature, in a way that it's sensitive. And what I also found that I didn't expect to find was that when they answered the survey and when we were concluding, many of them felt guilty for not addressing sexual violence to any great extent. And it's very interesting how the teachers kind of individualize a sense of guilt when the overall organization of teaching doesn't really help teaching in a way, because we haven't said too much about the curriculum, but these issues are not very explicit in the curriculum. It is not necessarily explicitly addressed in the teacher education, and there is just a whole bunch of structures that are not working in favor of such kind of teaching. And as a researcher, I felt like telling them that you shouldn't feel guilty, because it's not your individual fault in a way. It's the structure surrounding the organization of teaching is not enabling this kind of teaching, and I think we have to look at it at an organizational level instead of blaming the teachers.
Thank you. Minnie has got a question about intersectionality, and you mentioned intersectionality in your presentation, but let's give Minnie an opportunity to ask the question if you're able to.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. I work in rights and diversity education, an advisor to schools across Hampshire, primary and secondary. Quite a lot of pupil voice and participation work with youngsters and encourage them to advocate within their school settings. One of the other things that we do at local authority level is we do collate racist incidents and get feedback from schools, and we have just included in our survey to schools, annual survey to schools, LGBTQ plus homophobic incidents and sexist incidents as well, and behaviours and languages. So it's really interesting to look at that data and that feedback from our schools. We're one of the few counties in the UK that does that. But when I've been talking to young people about this issue, there's a real gap between what's reported by schools and what young people will tell you is going on because of the usualization of this type of behaviour, not just in school communities, but in wider societal communities. But one of the discussions that has come up with young people is actually when we're talking about sexual harassment, the tendency has been to look at that as being a sort of male on female sort of a habit. But actually, when I'm talking to the young people in our schools, there's an awful lot of harassment that goes on, particularly with boys on boys, and particularly for those children and young people who may identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community, in particular the transgender community, and children and young people with gender identity that may differ from the societal norm, if you like. So I just wondered whether that was an element or an aspect of your research that you were going to consider in the future or had considered, because I think that's quite important. And one more thing I just wanted to ask as well was also from the feedback working with teenagers particularly, it would suggest that the prevalence is online. There's so much that goes on online with particularly teenagers in terms of inappropriate images and texting of each other, which doesn't find its way into school. And there's a real culture within schools of it, they don't report it to anybody. So that's got real implications around rights respecting of self, you know, before you start sort of thinking about how other people are perceiving and treating you, but also your rights respecting of yourself in terms of sharing these images, because a lot of it is the pressure that girls are feeling to share these images to boys to feel wanted, desirable, acceptable. And they all seem to be jumping on this bandwagon. It's not addressed. There's not a rigorous enough counter narrative within the school framework, even with the new RSE curriculum. Hugh, sorry, that was a very long question.
But perhaps a quick response, because we have another question from Janice that we would like to get in before the end. So.
Yes, thank you very much. The action research I did last year focused on gendered harassment and different kinds of harassment, where we encouraged students to perform role plays, performing different kinds of harassment. And actually the transgender harassment was one dimension, but also peer or the same-sex harassment and the homophobic harassment. And we based that on Meyer's different categories of harassment, and also the digital dimension. And I'm working on that article now. It will be I call it Role Play for Children's Rights. But what was really interesting is that we wanted to cultivate the young learner's sense of agency, and the different groups in the role plays had to have an interventionist that actively intervene in the harassment, But when I interviewed the young learners after the role plays, they were actually, they felt very disempowered because in real life, no one intervenes. And it's kind of heartbreaking in a way, and it's almost like I get demotivated to write it because it's just sad. But in a way, I think we have to recognize their disempowerment and still address it, because at least if we look at previous research, it might increase, or teaching about sexual harassment might increase their ability to protect themselves if it happens in a way. It doesn't necessarily stop the occurrence, but it can increase their ability to protect themselves and to notify authorities if it's a breach of their rights, both in the real world and digitally.
I think some of you may be aware of the work of Sonia Livingston at LSE London School of Economics with her panel and her major research on digital children's rights and looking into a lot of these issues. But we've got two fairly similar questions, one from Janice and one from Kirsty. So Janice, would you like to ask your question, and then Kirsty, your question, and then we'll see what time we've got for a response.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. Really short question. I'm coming from a theoretical perspective. Fascinating presentation. Thank you, first of all. You talked about pedagogical opportunities, empowering teachers, transformative education. I'm just interested to know how you framed these. Which theories are you using? Because I'm kind of doing my PhD, and the whole term of pedagogical opportunities keep coming up. So I'm interested to know if you are influenced specifically from some specific theories when you talked about these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. And Kirsty's question is similar, but not identical. Kirsty?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm actually out driving the car right now for my daughter's handball, so I'm so sorry. But no, it's about that transformative thing that you were talking about. The case of Ingunn, at least what I read is that why it had such a powerful impact, it was because it came from her lived experience. So I was just asking how to do that type of transformative teaching without using the teacher's own lived experience of injustice.
Yes.
Thanks, Kirsty. So these are two questions about transformative teaching, and the first one was really about the theory, and the second one more about the practice.
Yes, in our, would you like to respond, Irene?
Hello?
Or was it Kirsty?
Well, I was just thinking about something you did in your project, Beate, which is very interesting. You made the students decide which topics they wanted to learn more about. I think that's kind of an empowering way to do teaching and to let the students decide. And maybe if they feel safe, we can also include their experiences.
I think
maybe you can say something more about that, Beate.
Yes. Briefly, when it comes to the theoretical perspectives, I have drawn on Laura Lundy and Gabriela Sainz, and also Audrey Osler's considerations on how children experience injustice differently regarding who they are in a way. And when it comes to the transformative aspect, I think you don't necessarily have to link it to the actual lived experience of children, but maybe link it to their life world. That was what we did last year with the role play. We didn't say that play out something you have experienced, but play out something that could happen in a scenario where you usually are, like at school, at a party, in a bus, and play out how this could look like if someone actually had intervened. So I think because drawing upon personal experience, it can be very, it can make the person feel very vulnerable. And I think you have to be very careful in order to do that. And it requires a lot of trust between the students and also the teacher. And I would not recommend it when it comes to physical abuse or abuse that has left one's, in which you are very traumatized, because it might not be the right pedagogical approach, I think.
Thanks, Beate. Thanks, Irene. Audrey, I know, wants to wrap up the session for us, but from my perspective, that was a really interesting presentation, and there are still some questions in the chat. Perhaps people can send them by email and get an answer then. But over
Definitely.
to Audrey to round off the evening seminar.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you very much, Beate. Thank you, Irene. I probably know this article as well as anybody because I'm one of the editors of Human Rights Education Review, and I've seen it at different stages in its development, and I've shared experiences with Beate in particular before and since. But I have learnt a whole load of new stuff from this seminar and new insights into your work. So I really appreciate that and wish to thank you both for coming along to this seminar, which may not be at the best time of day for you, but hopefully allows people from around the globe to participate. So thank you both very, very warmly. I really do appreciate your contributions. I want to stress that you can read this, and I do encourage you to read this article. It's on the Human Rights Education Review website, and you can go to that and find it there. You can also go there and find out about our forthcoming seminars. Our next seminar, I believe one of the presenters is with us right now, Megan Devenold. Our next seminar is on February the 10th. On February the 10th, we're going to be looking at human rights education in humanitarian settings, and to be looking particularly at human rights education and what is going on with refugee communities in Bangladesh and in Jordan. I encourage you to sign up for that. The registration is open in the same place as you found this, at the same website on the announcement page of Human Rights Education Review. And I think by sharing ideas today, I've also got to know some of you, and this is the beginning of a network where you can build on each other's strengths, each other's knowledge. So we encourage you to keep in touch via Twitter, via this seminar series, via the journal. And we also encourage you, if you have research that's related to this topic or to other topics addressing human rights education, if you feel there's something you are writing about in human rights education, about transformative learning or social justice, which either theoretical or a case study like this one or some other perspective, we welcome your submissions. So please feel free. And if you're not sure if something suits us, just jot down a short paragraph, send it to me, and I'll be pleased to comment and say, yes, I think this is something we would like to receive, or it might be something we'd like to receive if you do this and this. So I'd just like to thank you very warmly for coming along this evening. We could all have been watching what's going on in Washington, DC, but we've chosen to focus on the very close community of the classroom. And I hope that you have felt like me, that you had new insights this evening. So please come along, please share your ideas, please stay in touch. For those of us who are under more extreme lockdown, it's a real joy to see you here and to share ideas. I don't have the option, as Beate was telling me, that she has tomorrow, of going to my university to meet with my colleagues because I can't travel internationally. So I really appreciate this international group, and I encourage you to keep in touch with each other in as many ways as possible. Thank you all for attending. Thank you also to Gemma for your technical support you've offered us, May for setting the tweeting going, and please feel free to tweet afterwards. Some of you were concentrating really hard and no chance for tweeting. Please follow through and keep in touch with each other. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Please email me if you have any questions or would like to discuss.
Thank you very much.